Hello class, Professor Jim Albrecht here, and today we are studying Frederick Douglass's 1845 autobiography, a narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, written by himself. This period of literature we're studying in this unit, 1820 to 1860, is a really fascinating time because writers from various marginalized positions within American society, Native Americans, African Americans, women, really found their way into the public discourse, into the public realm of print culture in an unprecedented way. And the slave narrative genre is one of the most fascinating and important genres of American 19th century literature because it's such an interesting intersection of politics and a literary form. So, today I want to focus with you on some of the interests and challenges of reading Douglass's narrative. First of all, just to frame things, again, I want you to focus on the political power of the slave narrative as a form of autobiography. It's a very powerful genre for asserting the humanity of people who were enslaved. In a country that was dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, as Abraham Lincoln famously put it, slavery depended upon denying the humanity of the enslaved. And we've already seen this in Jefferson, for instance. The autobiography is a construction of a public self, and a great deal of the drama of understanding a slave narrative like Douglass's lies in this relationship between an author who must assert his humanity, and hence his right to freedom, to a dominant culture, or readers in that dominant culture, that denies his full humanity. So as an outsider in American society, Douglass very artfully appeals to and appropriates the values and ideals of mainstream American culture, portraying himself in the story of his life as embodying certain central American ideals and traits, and thus affirming his claim to democratic selfhood. Another aspect of this political power of autobiography in the slave narrative is the intimacy that is developed between readers of an autobiography and the author or narrator of the autobiography. A first-hand account of a life by the person who experienced it. That's what an autobiography is. And that's why people love to read autobiographies, right? Well, this effect, this intimacy between a reader and the author of a slave narrative, that made autobiography an incredibly powerful tool for the anti-slavery cause. Readers who had never directly seen, much less experienced, the evils of slavery could read the first-hand account of what it was like to live as a slave. And readers, by developing an imaginative and emotional sympathy with the narrator, would come to view slaves as human. So it's a very powerful example of the power of literature, of literary expression being turned to political purposes. And another very interesting aspect of autobiography, and we talked about this in relation to Franklin, and I want you to think about it now as well in relation to Douglass, is that dual role of the autobiographer in the text. Excuse me. The autobiographer is, on one level, a character in the plot, the main character, the hero or protagonist in the plot events that are going on. At the same time, the autobiographer is the narrator who is retelling those events. So the author's self is dramatized then on two different levels, both by the way that he acts in the major events of his life, in the plot of the story that's being told, but also in the way that as a narrator he talks about himself. Think about this in your own experience. You judge people very often in terms of the ways that they talk about themselves, right? Whether they're braggish or humble or modest or self-centered, whatever it might be. Well, it's true in an autobiography as well. And often in an autobiography, this involves very interesting moments where you have the older self, the author, the writer, the autobiographer who's telling the story, reflecting back on and talking about a younger version of him or herself, very often as a child or a youth. Okay, so I want to look today at a very interesting section from Douglass's narrative where I think you can see these types of issues playing out. So this is from chapter 6, and Douglass is describing here one of the many times in the book he talks about how he gained an education, how he learned to read and write. So here is a scene between him and Mr. and Mrs. Auld, who were his masters at this time. Very soon after I went to live with Mr. and Mrs. Auld, she very kindly commenced to teach me the ABC. After I had learned this, she assisted me in learning to spell words of 3 or 4 letters. Just at this point of my progress, Mr. Auld found out what was going on, and at once forbade Mrs. Auld to instruct me further, telling her, among other things, that it was unlawful, as well as unsafe, to teach a slave to read. To use his own words, further, he said, "If you give a nigger an inch, he will take an ell. A nigger should know nothing but to obey his master, to do as he is told to do. Learning would spoil the best nigger in the world. Now," said he, "if you teach that nigger," speaking of myself, "how to read, there would be no keeping him. It would forever unfit him to be a slave. He would at once become unmanageable and of no value to his master. As to himself, it could do him no good, but a great deal of harm. It would make him discontented and unhappy." These words sank deep into my heart, stirred up sentiments within that lay slumbering, and called into existence an entirely new train of thought. It was a new and special revelation explaining dark and mysterious things, with which my youthful understanding had struggled, but struggled in vain. I now understood what had been to me a most perplexing difficulty, to wit, the white man's power to enslave the black man. It was a grand achievement, and I prized it highly. From that moment I understood the pathway from slavery to freedom. It was just what I wanted, and I got it at a time when I the least expected it. Whilst I was saddened by the thought of losing the aid of my kind mistress, I was gladdened by the invaluable instruction which, by the merest accident, I had gained from my master. Though conscious of the difficulty of learning without a teacher, I set out with high hope and a fixed purpose, at whatever cost of trouble, to learn how to read. The very decided manner with which he spoke, and strove to impress his wife with the evil consequences of giving me instruction, served to convince me that he was deeply sensible of the truth he was uttering. It gave me the best assurance that I might rely with the utmost confidence on the results which, he said, would flow from teaching me to read. What he most dreaded, that I most desired. What he most loved, that I most hated. That which to him was a great evil to be carefully shunned, was to me a great good to be diligently sought, and the argument which he so warmly urged against my learning to read only served to inspire me with a desire and determination to learn, in learning to learn. In learning to read, I owe almost as much to the bitter opposition of my master as to the kindly aid of my mistress. I acknowledge the benefit of both. Okay, so there's a lot going on in this scene, and what I want you to think about is, again, what are the American traits or values of Douglas's self that he shows himself to be developing? What are the critiques of the institution of slavery that he makes in this scene? What about his depictions of white Americans? And lastly, how about this very complicated relationship between Douglas as the narrator, the adult, free writer and political activist who's writing this narrative in the present, and Douglas, the character in the plot, who is a child in slavery? So take a look at this passage again. I want to call your attention to several things. First of all, that as this story starts, Mrs. Auld has been teaching Douglas to read. So she has been showing him some kindness. And we have a scene here where white people are shown shifting from a kind treatment of a black person, of a slave, to a cruel treatment, which is making a commentary, right, about how white people are affected by the institution of slavery. And part of what's so fascinating about this scene is it exposes a contradiction in the ideology of slavery. Because slavery says it's okay to enslave Africans, African Americans, because they're not really human. And yet, slavery, the institution of slavery is saying you can't teach slaves how to read, because if you do, it will unfit them to be slaves. So that is an admission, really, that they're human, that they can learn, that they can be educated. And then when educated, like any other human being, they will be unhappy in slavery. They will use their education to try to escape. So there's a contradiction here, right, in the very ideas that Mr. Auld is expressing. And think about this as a dramatic scene. Here's young Frederick Douglass, maybe 10 years old, in a room with these two white adults, his owners, his masters, and they're talking about him. And they're talking about him right in front of him, right? And the word nigger, the N word, unfortunately, it's a word that comes up a lot in American literature. It's a factor of our racist past, and it's always difficult when you read American literature to come across it or have to read it out loud in a class if you're a professor like I am. But clearly this is one of those cases where an African-American writer, Frederick Douglass, wants us to hear that word, and because he repeats it. He repeats Mr. Auld saying it 3 or 4 times, right? Notice how Douglass quotes. He says, let me put it in his own words, right? And we get this language about not teaching slaves how to read. And of course that word nigger, which is a dehumanizing word, is being used at the same time as Mr. Auld is acknowledging, really, that slaves are human. That if you teach them, if you educate them, they're going to learn, right? They're going to resist slavery. And notice how young Frederick Douglass portrays himself in this scene, right? As he hears his master saying, "Don't teach him," he says, "These words sank deep into my heart," right? Suddenly he understands something very important, and he resolves, right? He says, he resolves from that moment forward that he will, at whatever cost of trouble, learn how to read. So what is he showing about himself as a human being, as a person here? He's smart. He's taking advantage of the situation to resist his masters, and he is enterprising. He's got a resolve to educate himself. And he's learning something here, even as his master is trying to prevent him from getting an education. He's turning the situation to his own benefit and learning something important about it, right? And one of the other very interesting things here is the relationship between Douglass as the adult, grown-up narrator and the young child. And one of the places that that comes in is when Mr. Auld is speaking about Frederick, young Frederick, right in front of him, and he's calling him the N-word, right? And he's saying, "If you teach that nigger," and then look at that in parentheses, Douglass says, "speaking of myself." We've had that word nigger 3 or 4 times in a couple of sentences, and there's Douglass, the narrator, reminding us as readers, I'm the one he's talking about, right? I was that young boy in the room, and now I'm the person telling you this story. He's talking about me. And it's a moment to remind the reader of this terrible discrepancy in slavery between the dehumanization of slaves and the humanity that Frederick Douglass can present directly to the reader by telling his story. The story of a young boy here who's being very enterprising and smart and resistant in a situation where he's in an institution that is trying to dehumanize him. And we see a little bit of that interesting tone of the narrator right in the close of this passage as well, right? He says, I owe almost as much to the bitter opposition of my master as to the kindly aid of my mistress. I acknowledge the benefit of both. Well, how do you hear the tone of that? He's saying, I'm grateful to both of these people. To my mistress, who was kindly enough to want to teach me, although we hear very soon that she turns into a bitter opponent of educating slaves as well. But he still thanks her for the kindness that she showed him, which is what? Well, we can read that as a very Christian type of a gesture, a humane gesture, being thankful towards one of your oppressors. But he also says, I thank my master for the kind instruction that he gave me here, right? He implies, which again is, in a way, he's poking at his master in retrospect a little bit here, right? You didn't want to educate me, but you did anyway. I got my education, and I owe you for what you said in front of me. There where you were treating me like you could say whatever you wanted to in front of me, and I was too stupid to even understand what's going on, right? And so in this scene, who comes out as the smarter person, right? Who comes out as the person who's more in control of the situation? It's really young Frederick Douglass, even as a child, and the Frederick Douglass now, who as an adult is looking back on this very kind of perverted and twisted situation within the institution of slavery and telling it to his readers. So it's a really good example of just how interesting and complicated and fascinating the relationship can be between a slave narrator and the story of slavery that he or she is telling and the readers who are hearing that story. So, with some of the ideas from this passage, I hope, under your belts and giving you some things to think about. I look forward to hearing what you all have to say in our discussions about the rest of the very interesting sections and interesting issues from Frederick Douglass's narrative. Thanks.